for mema wibia wo hwe me akwaba eba Pinax TV so na se me hye ensem a ekoso ase e de amawodi a atadwe Ghana for yasan ate de ne sen ye nyina wo ha na coronavirus eba besra ye president Akuffo Addo o ma ye nsuo ene nkania free for 3 good months eni jesem a yasan ate ne se wo yasan so be ma ye nsuo free na month cry ebe so no with details no ebe bro nti no kwaswa na ehwe me na wo other story so no ye so ye nyina ya sign nim say 4 years bia no Ghana ye ko election ye ko to aba so party bia e won campaign members a mo beboa ama campaign akoso na campaign members and as a campaign team no eno na be kire o message cry e ko Ghana for nchen so mo baji atu so mo ngie ntumu hye ye omba ye ne ade no so beboa so bedi nkunim ana se wundi enkunim na wo NDC mu no yenim say boa your campaign team members are boa party ni bebre na nipa pa kwa waba bonta be kasa say this year ekwan bia so he omo chifa suru chifa fomu enya de obeboa NDC with campaign and as Yewura John Dramani Mahama with campaign pacho mema mu details na wo hu onipa kra ye ka no asem na me pacho with ensam no ensha ase no ena ye finance minister Mr. Ken Ofori Atta I already mid-year budget review edema Ghana for yine ehu se ne wo mre mu no ye nim se mre bia mu no finance minister baba be man account when yama ekoso Ghana yesika se mu na ho ena okako make revelations bi na revelations ni nyina ne seden ye wo Ghana ha ena ye Ghana ye president His Excellency Nana Akuffo Addo ni feed address no obeka nsem bi wo mu se Ghana fo se ne coronavirus na ba na ho kyeraba ne memebe abenti no otete nyama bi so na nema na otete so no enya hwe se Ghana fo adehye ye be yusu nsuo for free 3 months ekra medu ba bi no constituencies na areas bi anomu ni nsuo no empanifo de politics ekosisi ho ebu nsuo mu free afei so ne kanea metwe light no osan so de my free for 3 months eno de na limit wo ho ebi wo ho no mu out mu se ye de nema tototo ho ne ye meje na me ne wo ka say de ani je sama Ghana fo ate anasa ye abama obi ani aja mafo bi ka say ye president de oboa obeyi usuli asisi ya ne say ye president na Akuffo Addo wasan so de free 3 months aka Ghana fo ho se Ghana fo wa wonsuo nku ade na nya ebula nku na wosa no de be yusu ni free enye no kwasan so the light aka ho free for 3 months but light no so sane kane no na limited da ho no san so na limited da ho we yakwakoye enijesem kase e dia maka na fonti nka 3 months ba ko no eson eye May no mu anka June ya manfo bebre na ye ready say omo kwako July omo ya maju so omo kwako tua but osan so the 3 months aka ho no e sha se free eye next month e de e kwonti say we ye Ghana ni na wo nsu wo fie na onim say nka 3 months na so de ye president na Akuffo Addo wasan ya surprise so o se ye san so nsu no for free 3 months and na meto aso dia Ghana fo NDC party ba kwa Ghana ha eba no amanyo se mo yenim se eni MPP o ma yete se kotoko ne has we ko na we yaba we ko na we yaba afi we be kwa akoma NDC na afi akoma NDC fo na this year so eni se flag bearer edema NDC enyo bia se Yewura John Dramani Mahama na nansen ya enche eno mo embe na emi omo campaign members and asem campaign team nipa makoma ko 23 bidin ebebe total bonten na enumu na koba se former general secretary edema NDC Yewura Koku Anyidoho ni dia mba mbepie mu eno ente nkodama fo fi so enya hye adwuma no omo aya gbogbo dom betini aye mene wo ka sei Koku Anyidoho aba bonten abeka nsem bi so no se NDC for twem mu frustro ekokwa fom tese bebi ombe kokofe bia nya dia this coming election na ida yenim December 7th no and as before class election because no obeboa Yewura John Dramani Mahama with a campaign onko on ha ne hompon konkoye eno ye nsem a amafo bisa no na eno nchirechemu ode ma ye no enyina ne se edi na ba beta bonten no ni di nka ho na ni di nka ho so no onkonkoye hwehwe ni mu so okwakoye campaign na mpo ye hye emremu a Yewura John Fifi Atamils, a former president, I mean, for the crazy year, or no, Oji, or no, Koku Addo, as the campaign member, now saying, Tima, not all Boama, and about to be a Becosono echo. So almost 3 years, and Sakrana, to make the Becocosis son as election, a Babashisha so, and Ghana for you, Nabidia dance, say. Well, no, we're raising president damage. Former old president, when you're the baby call Yewura John Fifi Atamils, I'm a president. Into Mahama. Enti mi Antonin Sanfre na enya de obeba mpacho ne nsem o kan ye no enie. I'm not a magician. I'm a hard worker. I'm not a clairvoyant. President Mills called me 3 years and gave me time to work. I had to work. I had to think. how to pray, how to meditate. I'm not a magician. I work hard. We need in summer work. And all to us, wakasa. We won't say a president, former president, when you be fair, no. 3 years along the line, Crown Sana, or Babaya campaign, amana, or the Babaya president, which him so, Oma, you are John the man Mahama Formono. I don't want the Monia Ghana for now. It's me, Jumano. Now, some more come and soon say, I bring the names out and the teams out. I'm not a wayfarer. The records have it that I produced a president before and worked for a president. Let others do some. Into no patch say or no a ye kuku anyido why campaign member da. To say wabua with campaign mama former president when baby call Era John a friend saying 50 years meals 80 be president why be da. So ono aye be da no. After France to ebeti me ayeti this year dear. So ye this ni now I reshemu ewo kwekwa yi do home say obaba ye campaign e dey amaye John Dramani Mahama mo ababa we need this year election there the patrol ye shatawale nyum forget no oboma wonte wo say utimi forget ni nyina because we see nenu mutuo say eya dey afie yi obaba ye campaign e dey amaye former president John Dramani Mahama and also the National Democratic Congress NDC somo efamra power but no the party no odasua ewo mu Abusuafo and we need news was about answer ni beja ho akonene sani bidi kan say mid year review no budget review no ekọ so e parliament house nyabotre na hye ensem ekọ so ni account your finance minister Mr. Ken Ofori-Atta no so be make e magana for na tete bi film na sisi bi film na wa hwese ne oka no ne kwan so no no anasa won no enye adwen
in the corresponding period of 2019. The agricultural sector recorded a growth of 2.8% in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2.2% during the same period in 2019. Industry sector recorded a growth of 1.5% in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 8.4% during the same period in 2019 because of massively decreased oil exports. Growth in the services sector was strong at 9.5% in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 7.2% recorded during the same period in 2018. Mr. Speaker, headline inflation remained flat at 7.8% from January until March 2020. Inflation, however, rose to 10.6% in April and further to 11.3% in May, reflecting the panic buying that preceded the market fumigation exercises and across the country and the partial lockdown in two largest cities of Accra and Kumasi. Inflation has increased marginally to 11.2% in June as pressure food prices began to decline due to the easing of the restrictions. Mr. Speaker, from the beginning of the year, May 2020, growth in broad money supply has slowed down, increasing by 6% compared to a 7% increase over the corresponding period in 2019. Credit advanced by banks to public and private institutions also decreased the first 5 months of the year as demand and supply for loans dropped due mainly to the uncertainties created by COVID-19 pandemic and decline in aggregate demand. Mr. Speaker, the Monetary Policy Committee of Bank of Ghana reduced the monetary policy rate by 150 basis points to 14.5% in March 2020 as part of broad measures to reinvigorate economic activity. The interbank rate declined from 15.2% in December 2019 to 13.8% in June 2020, reflecting the reduction in the MPR in March 2020 and improved liquidity conditions in the banking sector. Similarly, interest rates on the 91-day Treasury instruments climbed to 13.97% in June 2020, 14.69% in December 2019. Our blending rate also decreased to 21.95% from 23.59% over the same comparative period, reflecting improved liquidity conditions in the banking sector and constrained demand for loanable funds. Balance payments. Mr. Speaker, the current account recorded a surplus of 199.9 billion, 0.3% of GDP in the first quarter of 2020, up by 12.4% from 177.8 billion, 0.3% of GDP in the same period in 2019. The increase in the current account surplus was influenced largely by improvements in the trade balance as well as current exports. The trade balance recorded a surplus, Mr. Speaker, of $1.0 billion compared to a surplus of $1.2 billion in the corresponding period of 2019, mainly on account of a sharp decline in import growth, which more than outweighed the fall in exports. As a result of developments in the external sector, the overall balance of payments recorded a surplus of $1.5 billion compared to a surplus of $2.97 billion recorded in the first quarter of 2019. Mr. Speaker, the country's gross international reserves stood at $9.2 billion at the end of June 2020 from a stock position of $8.4 billion at the end of December 2019. This was sufficient to provide 4.3 months of import cover compared to 4 months of import cover as of December 2019. Mr. Speaker, the Ghana CD started the year strongly, appreciating by 4.5% on a year-to-year basis by end of February 2020 on the back of the US $3 billion sovereign bond issue, strong macroeconomic fundamentals, and BOG's forward auction sales, amongst others. However, the deterioration in financial market risk sentiment due to the spread of COVID-19, as well as the seasonal demand pressure from the energy and corporate sectors, weighed heavily on the cedi. On a year-to-date basis, the cedi depreciated by 2.4% against the dollar and the euro in June 2020, but appreciated by 4.5% against the pound sterling, compared to a depreciation of 8.3%, 6.9%, and 7.6% against the dollar, euro, and the pound sterling, respectively, over the same period in 2018. Mr. Speaker, this is the lowest depreciation of the currency in any election year, and especially remarkable in these COVID times. We thank God for the foresight in issuing our Eurobond in February of this year. Mr. Speaker, the implementation of the government's fiscal policy for 2020 has been greatly impacted by the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. Provisional fiscal data for the first half of the year showed that revenue mobilization fell short of target non-oil, non-tax revenues. Let me, however, congratulate GRA's leadership and tax division for exceeding their tax targets by some 600 million Ghana cedis. Expenditure execution, on the other hand, was faster than programmed due to the emergency spending on the various COVID-19 related programs. Mr. Speaker, these developments pushed our financing requirements above the program limits for the period to enable us to address these emergency expenditure pressures. Consequently, the fiscal deficit for the period widened from a program target of 3.1% of GDP to 6.3% of GDP. The corresponding primary balance for the period was in deficit of 3.3% of GDP compared to a targeted primary deficit of 0% of GDP. Revenue performance. Mr. Speaker, total revenue and grants for January to June 2020 amounted to 22.0 billion Ghana cedis compared with a program target of 29.8 billion Ghana cedis, resulting in a shortfall of 26.0% or a performance rate of 74%. This represents a nominal decline of 6.8% over the corresponding period in 2019. Mr. Speaker, non-oil tax revenue comprising taxes on income and property, goods and services, and international trade amounted to 16.7 billion or 4.3% of GDP, 16.2% below the program target of 19.95 billion or 5.2% of GDP. The lower than program performance in non-oil tax revenue was driven by the underperformance of non-oil tax handles such as domestic VAT, petroleum excise taxes, domestic national health insurance levy, Get Fund levy. However, personal income and communication tax, services tax, both have performed their respective targets for the period. Mr. Speaker, revenue from upstream oil and gas amount to 1.99 billion, 0.5% of GDP, 55.4%, Mr. Speaker, lower than the program target of 4.5 billion Ghana cedis. This was mainly on account of much lower volumes and significant drop in crude oil prices on the international market, coming as low as $12 at some point. Mr. Speaker, total expenditures including arrears clearance for the period amounted to 46.4 billion Ghana cedis, or 12% of GDP, compared with the program target of 41.6 billion, or 10.8% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, with the exception of interest payments and grants to other government units, which were below their respective targets, compensation of employees, goods and services, and capital expenditure were above target due to the additional spending requirements in relation to COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the result of government's fiscal operations resulted in a cash basis deficits of 24.3 billion, or 6.3% of GDP, compared with the program target of 11.8 billion, or 3.1% of GDP for January to June 2020. Mr. Speaker, the overall budget balance of finance from both domestic and external sources. Total domestic financing amounted to 21.8 billion, equivalent to 5.7% of GDP, and constituted 89.5% of the total financing. Foreign financing amounted to 2.6 billion Ghana cedis, some 0.7% of GDP, against a target of 15.1 billion, or 3.9% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, the primary balance recorded a deficit equivalent to 3.3% of GDP, higher than the program deficit of 0.01% of GDP, mainly due to lower than program revenues and faster execution of its expenditures. Mr. Speaker, consistent with the front-loading of government fiscal operations, the financing needs of government were also front-loaded. As earlier stated, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in the tightening of global financial conditions. Fortunately, our $3 billion international capital market financing was conducted in the first 2 months of the year. In addition, the IMF's US $1 billion rapid credit facility was also executed in April 2020. In a matter of 4 months, Mr. Speaker, through good leadership and international goodwill brought about by efficient management of the economy, this nation was able to raise over 20 billion Ghana cedis to protect the vulnerable, our businesses, and our dignity as a people. Taking into consideration all these developments,